Welcome back. It's time now for Focus here on France24. Now, it hasn't been long since more than a dozen African states celebrated their half-century of independence, although some observers are saying that neo-colonialism still lingers on. Well, one of the trappings of that perceived colonialism is the currency, the CFA Franc, which is a currency pegged to the euro and guaranteed by the French Treasury. Well, in a moment, we'll be speaking to an Africa expert, but first, let's have a closer look at that currency.
A bustling market in Bamako, buy and sell in Abidjan, rapid marketplace exchanges in Dakar. They all have one thing in common. The money passed between customers and traders is the same, the CFA franc, the franc of the financial community of Africa. Following the end of the Second World War in 1945, France introduced the common currency in its African colonies. The currency has undergone changes, both aesthetic and in terms of value. But for nearly 70 years, circulation of the CFA franc has continued across much of West and Central Africa. The CFA franc zone is made up of 15 countries. 8 use the West African franc and 6 use the Central African franc. And another former French colony, thousands of miles away in the Indian Ocean, is also part of the zone. Residents in the Comoros Islands use the Comorian franc. These countries started to break away from the French colonial empire in the 1950s and 60s, but many chose to keep their CFA francs. In 1972, leaders from Africa and France agreed to establish a post-independent CFA franc zone. 40 years later, Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara met with the French finance minister in Paris to mark 40 years since the first agreements were signed.
I think the population would be worse off if it weren't for the CFA franc zone. It's the case in a number of other African countries which don't use the franc. So it is a big part of development for us.
Holding on to the currency has its advantages. The CFA franc has a fixed exchange rate with the euro and is guaranteed by the French Treasury.
Africa and Europe have a common destiny. For a long time, Africa has contributed to economic growth in Europe. At the same time, growth in Europe is vital for African growth.
But the CFA franc has its critics. Franc zone countries have to deposit a substantial share of their foreign exchange reserves into the Bank of France. And the benefits of their close ties to the euro are questionable, given deepening financial crisis in the eurozone.
Well, to tell us more, we're joined now by Yves Ekoué Amaïzo, who is an independent expert on the African Union. He joins us now from Vienna. And now, what's your opinion that this single currency unit, or it's actually a double currency unit, depending on which countries we're talking about, is it a force for stability, or is it a force of France having a hold over its former colonial powers?
It is a very interesting question. The first point about stability is about stability for whom? If you talk about France, for sure, if you talk about those who are leading those 15 and Comoros countries, Francophone zone, this is also stability for those who are still in power. What I found out in terms of stability is that it stopped basically the political alternance in most of those countries. It also didn't support the democratical process of alternance, of change of political regime. So I don't know exactly what we should put behind the stability. Now, coming to the economic aspect, I'm not quite sure that countries who are not in a position to export much could benefit really from the whole system, because that currency is quite very high in terms of pegging. And that is a fundamental problem. And all of the positions taken are those from the Central Bank of Europe today. Before it was the French. As a matter of fact, just to make things very clear, you correctly pointed out in the presentation that it is linked to the French Treasury, which means that, as a matter of fact, that currency is not really convertible in any other country. You have to go through the euro and before to the French franc.
So what are you saying is in this for France today? Why would France benefit from this arrangement continuing? Explain that for us.
Okay, France is still benefiting because 15 countries plus Comoros are basically putting up to 50%, 50, of their reserve to the French Treasury, which means the French decided whether to do something with that amount of money or even to, if it could happen, to just make a mess out of it. It happened, in fact, in the past. So the point is that when that happened, what is the meaning of doing a lot of effort in Africa and don't make use of it? When you talk about small, medium enterprises or credit, the loans which are provided to the African economy, that is basically provided to the French economy. Another very interesting problem, why now that we are in the Eurozone, we still have to pay moving from Euro to franc CFA? Why should people, it is a kind of discrimination, financial discrimination, by the way, for the African diaspora. The second very interesting point, why most of the 27 countries in European zone or Eurozone, the 17th, are not sitting in the board of the franc zone discussion, is still the French. You may tell me, of course, there is only 2% basically of the monetary activities there. But the point is that it's basically stopped the leverage that African countries could accept or could move forward. I can agree with you that it's also a problem from the African side. If you check what is happening, I was expert from the African Monetary Fund, or the way or how Africa should come out with a common currency. It does not work yet. In fact, it is postponed to 20-something. The point is that there's a kind of connection among decision makers, especially Minister of Finance, governors of central banks, and the French economy. And from that point of view, it will be quite difficult to move this franc CFA forward.
Okay, before we go back to the Eurozone, because I do want to pick you up on that point again in just a moment, just make the point that a lot of countries never signed up, in fact, for the CFA franc, countries like Tunisia and Morocco. Is there a sense that those that didn't sign up for it have fared better or worse than those that did?
Let's put the question differently. Mauritania, for instance, left in 1703, I remember, which reduced the West Africa to 15, the ECOWAS region. Whether it is better, I think so. The issue is that if you are flexible in terms of fixed exchange rate, you can always decide what you want in terms of monetary decision. So monetary governance belongs to Tunisia, Algeria, or Mauritania today. It means it's a political decision, as a matter of fact. And nobody, at least in the Francophone zone, are not taking that decision. Mali took it some time and came back. Guinea was also out and came back. So the issue behind it is a power relation. If the power relation and you have enough courage to stand up, then maybe you can come out. But the level they have reached now, it has to be a kind of collective decision. And to do that, you need what we call convergence. Most of those economies should converge to the same direction, having basically same level of inflation, same level of GDP, gross domestic product, etc. The point is that if you start to go into details, they don't converge, basically. And if you add to the Francophone zone, the English-speaking Ghana or Nigeria, for instance, in the western side, it is even worse. So the point is that, do they really want to converge today and tomorrow, eventually, for their own debt, to find somebody within the region to cover that debt, which is the issue of the African Monetary Fund, which is still under discussion, but not yet approved. Who is basically approving that? Let me add something which maybe will create problems. Some of the central bank governors are not paid by the African government. They are paid by international organizations. They are paid by foreigners, sometimes with various aid support from countries which are outside the zone. So the issue is that who is working for whom?
All right, you raise a lot of interesting points, but I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Yves Ekoué Amaïzo, who is an independent expert on the African Union. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. That was Focus.